so much honesty and courage coming up, and my immediate thought was because America. Right? Like that's what we perceive to be. I mean, that's how we got who we got as president, because he has the courage to be honest and say what he really feels like. So I think that's why people perceive those, because those are the two that is in the mythos or the zeitgeist, I guess.
I was just curious too about a couple of things. One, the relation between humility and patience, what you were seeing there, and I'm wondering what kind of overlap there might be. A lot of people, I think, presume or have this conceptualization of humility being, like reserved and not assertive, and and that seems to be a lot of overlap. So I'm wondering if people are, interpreting those two in a way that need to be teased out a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm trying to see if I think humility and patience were two of the virtues that were like most strongly. They had the most like similar profile of perceived effects on other virtues. So it does seem like people treat them as somewhat being somewhat interchangeable, and it makes sense because both imply like restraint and like not being assertive.
I also had a question about the framing of the language. When there's a conflict, I think you're right that people are thinking about that in kind of like mutually exclusive ways, right? Maybe what about language like such that when virtues might be in tension, or to what degree you perceive there to be a tension between the two. I'm wondering if that might change people's interpretations.
So the question is like, instead of asking was there a trade-off, asking like to what extent there was a trade-off.
Well, or the use of the word tension instead of conflict.
Right. Yeah, I think that would have been an alternative wording. It was really hard for us to figure out how best to ask this question. Like, we workshopped many versions. We didn't try the tension wording. One thing that I thought could be fun to talk about is the idea of like foundational virtues. That was actually one of the motivations for that project, where we asked people about like how improving one virtue would improve others, because there's been some discussion in the literature about master virtues, like self-control as being a moral muscle, or gratitude as a fount of other virtues, and humility has been proposed as well. So I'm curious to hear like your views on why humility, and like why humility over other virtues is being more foundational.
Yeah, I'm still wrestling with that, and I started with actually thinking about that with curiosity. I think curiosity can be seen as more one of those foundational virtues that is required, right, to for proper engagement in the world, and so I know that's contentious. I wonder if humility, it depends on a lot of our definitions, right? So that's why I was presenting the conflicts of the definitions, and how if we think about it as a deliberate kind of quieting of our own impulses to open ourselves up to the world, to me that seems foundational in a way that showing gratitude as a phasic virtue does not, in a way that showing courage in specific cases does not, right? So I'm wondering if there's a lot more to think about there, but I'm wondering if even when we think about the monkish virtues, maybe there's a paired with humility and curiosity of some foundational element to both, right? That sets the stage for our ability to exercise or embody others. I don't know. I'm still thinking through that.
Yeah.
I think I agree that curiosity and humility are somehow linked. I think it's important to think about whether we're perceiving curiosity as a moral virtue or an epistemic virtue. We often talk about intellectual humility, and which implies like curiosity as like something that will help you learn more. Whereas if we perceive curiosity and humility as moral virtues, it's about locating the self. I think like I was in those scenarios, the scenario you gave of like, well, I couldn't be honest about how easy it was to get pregnant because I wanted to show compassion to my friend who was going through fertility treatments. But you could also imagine how you could say part of being compassionate is having the humility to recognize that I don't know how to be compassionate because I don't know the pain that you are in. Instead of pretending and like and performing politeness, performing ideas of compassion, as opposed to actually being fully messy and present with this person, instead of like, to me, that's really decentering yourself. That's really like being vulnerable. Because you're still centering yourself if you're like, I am being compassionate by demonstrating restraint about how easy it was. You know, like I don't know what else to say, but to me that there's like an important distinction there.
Right, so like lack of humility makes it tempting for people to jump to the conclusion that one course of action is the obviously right one, as opposed to recognizing that there are multiple ways to resolve these tensions. This is a tough question because, in philosophy, in the Aristotelian conception of a virtue, there's that idea of a golden mean, where like you can have an excess or a deficiency of a virtue, but the virtue is in the middle. So you could imagine situations where someone is being too honest, and that turns into tactlessness. But then they would also argue that true honesty is the golden mean, so you can't really have too much honesty. Just like empirically, how I've approached this question is just asking participants to rate the moral relevance of a list of traits. And then I just pick the ones that are rated as consistently being morally relevant. So for example, using this method, we find that people think that gratitude and compassion are virtues, whereas like low anxiety or sociability are not virtues. So that's just using a strictly empirical method.
Yeah, difficult. I would go back to the claim that having practical wisdom, right, is knowing the right amount of the application of the virtue at the right time, right, and so that involves having an awareness of the evils of a system or how it might benefit different people and not me, right, and exercising, deciding on courage or patience or whatever. Yeah, but it's about, okay, how much phronesis have I accumulated, right, to address that situation and respond to it appropriately. We're always going to be struggling with that individually. But that's all I have to say.
I have nothing to say. Question in the back corner there.
Okay, I will start speaking. Thank you. I also have a question for Jessie. So about the, I guess the first part about, how often does morality come up in people's decisions? You asked people about virtues. That obviously is going to constrain the response. If you'd asked a broader question, maybe like, how often did you have a decision about a right or wrong way of treating somebody else? You might have gotten a slightly higher percentage. Peter Singer would have given 100%. But I guess the bigger question is like, what do you think hinges on the does anything theoretically interesting hinge on the percentage? And an even broader question than that, because I'm very much with you on the importance of studying everyday life, but the downside, the danger of studying everyday life is that we end up doing description for the sake of description. That our papers end up being lists of percentages of things happening at various rates, without sort of gaining much theory out of it. So that's where my question is coming from. Like, how can we leverage what you have to answer interesting theoretical questions?
Yeah. So I will say, just in response to that second thing, I think psychology doesn't do enough description, which is why like a lot of my research. Oops, sorry. I think psychology doesn't do enough description, so a lot of my work does aim to answer basic descriptive questions, like how often are different moral virtues relevant in everyday life, and like are moral people happier? Because I feel like you can't really you can't truly answer theories or like form the best theories without having the building blocks of observations. So my work tends to be more observational, descriptive, naturalistic, rather than theory-driven for that reason. But in terms of like what this could contribute theoretically, I think it answers broader questions about like how often morality is actually relevant and a salient concern in people's lives. If the percentages after like based on this virtue-based approach were still like 5 or 10%, then this would suggest that morality is just not something that is even relevant in everyday life. The relative percentages also point to what kinds of moral virtues tend to be more or less relevant. Ooh, so many questions. All right.
Thanks. This is another question for Jessie. So kind of also on this first study about, where you found this difference between like when people think virtues are relevant in everyday life and then this tiny little fraction where they thought that morality and virtue is relevant in everyday life. So what's striking there is it seems like people are intuitively drawing a distinction between like moral, like the moral domain and the non-moral domain. And I was just curious if you had any more data on how they were drawing that distinction, or if not, if you could speculate.
I can speculate. I think like the distinction for these like everyday moments might be severity. Like if you feel like the situation involved honesty and it was very severe, then you might also say it was moral. What was the other part? Was that it? Do we have any data? I don't think we have any data to actually be able to like distinguish. I think if we had like open-ended responses of why there was an opportunity to be honest and why there was an opportunity to be moral, we could probably like look at the open-ended responses that way. I just wanted to go back to the other question though about theory. I think one interesting implication is like when do everyday experiences when do people think their everyday experiences are morally relevant versus go unnoticed because they're just part of the background and just part of people's social norms? I had this question a couple of weeks ago where someone said, like, if you're going to go pay for something at a store, sure, you had the opportunity to be dishonest and not pay, but probably people wouldn't say that they had an opportunity to be dishonest because it didn't even occur to them that was a possibility. So I think this points, when people do notice that there are opportunities to be compassionate versus honest versus fair, I think this points to like questions of when do people notice their experiences as being morally relevant.
Continue this over lunch. Thank you all